Hi, I'm Anjali Alappat, the host of Arcx, a series about literary inspiration. I have loved fantasy and science fiction for as long as I can remember. In these strange times, these stories are a wonderful form of escape, doorways to different worlds, offering glimpses into possible futures. In Season 4, I'm going to be talking to some wonderful South Asian fantasy, sci-fi, and speculative fiction writers to find out what really made them want to tell stories. We're going to talk about books, movies, TV shows, and other media that shaped and influenced them as writers. Today we're chatting with writer and editor Gigi Ganguly. Her first book, a novella called One Arm Shorter Than the Other, was published in 2022 and was nominated for a Subjective Chaos kind of award in 2023. Her latest book, a collection of weird and wonderful stories about the natural world called Biopeculiar, was published in 2024. We had an amazing chat which covered a lot of topics from Steinbeck and Elon Musk to K-dramas, rain songs, and robots. You can follow Gigi on Twitter at Gigi Ganguly. Hi Gigi, thank you so much for joining us today on Arcx and helping us kickstart Season 4.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
So, first things first, there's something I'm always excited to ask any author who's on the show. Could you tell us a bit about your journey as a writer? How did you get started? Did you always want to be one?
I don't think I ever wanted to be a writer. Like when I was about 10 or 11, I still had no idea what to do with my life. And I had my favorite subjects, but I had no clear direction where to go. When the time came for me to join a college, I went with geography because that was one of my favorite subjects. I suddenly realized by year 3 that I couldn't really do a master's in this subject. And I was more interested in writing as a profession. And around that time, one of our acquaintances had gotten into a journalism school. So I thought I'll do the same. So my writing journey actually started with journalism. I did a course in that. I started working at a newspaper. I was in the features department of a newspaper. I used to write about food, books, music, arts and culture, travel, all sorts of things. One day I suddenly decided that I want to do like a solo trip because I think a lot of us just get that bug when you're in your 20s and 30s that you want to, travel around the world on your own. And for some reason, I can't explain why, but I decided on Scotland and Ireland. And while I was there in Ireland, especially, I loved the city of Dublin and the literary air all over the city, the Trinity College, the St. Stephen's Park, this presence of Oscar Wilde and Beckett and even Rabindranath Tagore. There's a statue of him over there. And I sort of fell in love with that city and I decided that I wanted to pursue writing as a subject as well. I wanted to pursue creative writing. And basically, I eventually got into a college in Ireland. And it was there when it made sense to me that, okay, this is the line I should follow. And it was there in 2020 where I wrote my first book, the novella, One Arm Shorter Than the Other. Within like 2 or 3 months, I found a really good publisher for it. I came back to India and the book got published while I was here. And I think around 2022-23 is when I started writing my second book, Biopeculiar. I was living in Delhi as well as a cottage in the Himalayas, and both places sort of inspired me to write stories about nature, about climate change, about the relationship between cities and nature and animals. And that's how I've arrived at this juncture.
I love that Ireland had a part in your writing journey. And I love that there was Rabindranath Tagore and of course Oscar Wilde, both of whom are big favorites of mine. Something else that I always ask is, were there any particular books or movies or TV shows that influenced your storytelling and writing?
When it comes to speculative fiction, I'll say Ted Chiang and Ken Liu. Those are my favorites when it comes to short stories in speculative fiction genre. Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, which was the inspiration behind the film Arrival. Like that's one of my favorite stories of all time. Yeah. When it comes to an overall writing style, then my 3 favorites are John Steinbeck, especially Travels with Charlie, which is sort of like a travelogue with his dog Charlie. And they're basically basically traveling across America in the 60s. The second would be Asha Purna Devi's short story collection titled Matchbox. So I've read the translated version, but still I absolutely love her language, her stories, her ideas. And my favorite thing is that they were written so long ago, but they still feel so recent and modern in some way. And I love her short stories because of that. And the third is Jhumpa Lahiri, specifically her book titled In Other Worlds, which is basically her story of how she fell in love with Italian and how she struggled basically to sort of learn that language. What I loved about that book was her wanting something so badly and struggling with it and eventually sort of mastering it. So yeah, these three books and these three writers I'd say are my favorites.
I must say, thanks to talking to you, I was inspired to kind of pick up Steinbeck again. I had put him aside after doing my undergrad in English, and I revisited him in a new way, this time with Travels with Charlie, because I think I'd only read his very big books, which were, of course, Grapes of Wrath and
East of Eden.
Yes, East of Eden. And I mean, those both left a big impression on me, but in the sense that they were classics. So they felt like a very different category to what I read now. Reading Travels with Charlie, I felt like I saw a very different aspect of him. And I really, really enjoyed it because it is observational writing in a very fascinating way, at a very different time from the one we live in, but at the same time, very relatable. Thank you for putting me onto it.
Another thing with Charlie is that it's so funny. I mean, you have this image of Steinbeck being serious, or as you said, he's part of that classic literature thing. But Travels with Charlie shows us this sort of like a human figure who loves his dog so much and also respects dogs. He doesn't want to baby his dog. And stuff like that is really interesting to read about such a famous and notable writer.
You're right, because he was hilarious.
Yeah.
I think the novel of his which left the biggest impression on me earlier was Of Mice and Men. And I remember being so upset at the ending of that book and then being like, I don't know if I'm going to read any more of this man's writing, because obviously in my teenage years, it felt incredibly unfair. But in this particular one, I love the characterization of Charlie. And as you said, he clearly respects and loves Charlie, but doesn't forget that Charlie is a dog. You know?
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting kind of line because, of course, Charlie is described with very human-centric language. He draws a fine line saying things like, Charlie kinds of looks at human beings like, are you crazy? I found that very endearing.
There's also a part where they've arrived at the national park with massive redwood trees, and Steinbeck tries so hard so that Charlie pees on one of the trees so that it becomes, like a cool story or something. But his dog just does not listen to him. You can tell your pet to do something, but they will just not listen.
I really love that bit because he was kind of saying, I've hidden him from these kind of trees because God knows what will happen to his mind when he sees a redwood. And what really did happen is that Charlie kind of patronizingly looked at Steinbeck and was like, sure, if you really want me to, I will pee on this tree. And you're right, there's no way to kind of control or even comprehend what they're going to do next. You mentioned, obviously, Steinbeck's writing, Jhumpa Lahiri, who I think of as a very formative writer for me as well. I haven't read any Asha Purna Devi, and I will now that you've mentioned her. But I wanted to ask, what do you think you've drawn upon from these books in your own writing?
I'd say when it comes to Asha Purna Devi, it would be the short story writing formula, as in the way I approach short stories is that I try to keep things quite simple. I mean, there are obviously elements of speculative fictions and there might be aliens and all sorts of weird things happening, but my goal is to keep things very simple and to make the reading very easy. I try not to overcomplicate stuff. My intention is that both kinds of readers who have read speculative fiction before and those who haven't read it before, both should enjoy what I've written. I draw inspiration from her writing through that because, again, her writing was written so many years ago, but it still feels very familiar. And there's a sort of comfort in them. With Travels with Charlie, I think I read this book in my early 20s. The opening lines of that book is like one of my favorite opening lines of all time because it's not to do with dogs or anything. As in, like, he's searching for something. There is that restlessness in him, which he describes it so beautifully. And again, the word words are not overcomplicated or anything, but the way he crafts the sentences are beautiful. And with Jhumpa Reddy, I just love her writing because, again, the way she crafts her sentences are beautiful because they are, again, very simple-ish, normalish words, but the way she brings them together and the way she creates metaphors and how she describes how she's feeling, how she describes her inner turmoil. So those kind of feelings, I think she brings out so beautifully. And I think coming back to all three of them in an overall way, I'd say it's how to use simple words and how to bring out intricate feelings, but sort of craft them in a way that looks beautiful.
That's lovely. And I think you've really succeeded with Biopeculiar because I habitually read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy and, generally genre fiction, but I really tore through your book. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. And I'm not always a short story person. So that was kind of a surprise to me. But there was something so gentle and lovely about these stories. And even though they were exploring some very serious themes, I kind of felt like you were holding my hand and walking me through stuff, which was very nice. Before we dig into it, I'd like to invite you to just tell us a little bit about the book and about the format that you've chosen.
I've always been more comfortable writing shorter stories. Even with my first book, even though it was a novella, I had sort of bifurcated it. And even then, the first half was made up of 3 chapters. So shorter stories is something that comes naturally to me. I actually struggle writing novels and longer forms, stories more than 50 pages. That seems very daunting to me for some reason. So with my second book, it was just an intuition, something that came from inside me that I have to write short stories. And when I started compiling the list of ideas that I had, I didn't know that it would be nature themed. It just happened in that way. A theme did emerge out of all the ideas that I had collated. From there on, it was a conscious decision to make this about climate change and animal-human relationships and those kinds of things. If I would have to describe the book in one line, I think the tagline of the book does it quite well. It's basically short stories about our uncertain world, where we're at this stage right now that every single day there's some news that climate change is right here. There are droughts, there are floods, there are rising temperatures, there are rising sea levels, there are animals, plants, insects dying out. In this kind of world, I couldn't help but write these kind of stories, which sort of explores our relationship with the animal world, but also dives inside the animal world and looks at the world from their perspectives.
I totally got that while reading the book because one of the key themes for me in this book really has been communication. And I think that ties back to what you mentioned, this communication between humans and nature or between animals themselves. Why was that so important for you to explore the idea of this connection between all these species?
I think that comes from how I've grown up. I've grown up with dogs and I've always felt closer to animals than humans, I'd say. And when you look at dogs on the street or even pet dogs, someone else's pet dog, you look at them as a dog, as a different species. But when you're living with them, that boundary sort of disappears. They are a part of your family. So they have been like my siblings. Right now, my cats, they're my children, basically. So I've always felt like the world is unfair to animals. One of the most unfair things is that they have to bear the consequences of our actions because we want development and we want more land for housing and we want more roads and helipads and stuff like that. We decide that it's okay to destroy a part of their environment. I feel very helpless because there is nothing I can do about it, but the only thing I can do is write about how I feel and write from their point of view.
I think that comes through very clearly. And something else that I noticed was that you were kind of drawing attention to the human-centric nature of our world. For example, Head in the Clouds, Toothache, Cocoon, or even The Golden Bird. The narrative is centered around human thoughts and experiences. And the more than human is almost a narrative device. So it's really about how humans perceive nature rather than how nature actually is. Did you want to come across that way deliberately?
Yeah, with stories where I was exploring the human nature relationship, I did want to show our point of view as well as theirs, and also show how we are ruining their world through our actions. Like in Head in the Clouds, which came about while I was studying geography, climatology was one of my favorite subjects, and I loved reading about clouds and learning about the different types and stuff. And just even the idea of clouds, there is such a fantastical element to them, because when we look up, we are always looking for shapes and metaphors in them. It felt like a very gentle way to introduce the book with this story. In this very story, I've basically compared clouds to sheep and cattle and animals that we sort of keep at our farms. And even though we might care for them, we are using them for our own purposes. And I wanted to draw a comparison between that and how the protagonist feels in this story. He feels very distraught about the way he's treated his flock of clouds.
I really enjoyed that one. I also couldn't help but notice that even at the end of that story, when something happens to him, it's still very much about him saying sorry and kind of asking forgiveness and stuff like that. But then we never learn what happens after that to the clouds. And I was just thinking, is that not the sum of the human nature experience?
But that is also generally something that I try to do with my stories. Once you've finished reading it, I still want the reader to think, oh, what must have happened with the other characters, or what must have happened after the ending of this story. So that is something that I do try to intentionally work on.
Pivoting a little bit, there are two very lovely stories which don't have any real human interference in them. One is a murder mystery involving a crow, and the other is a sort of royal family political thriller about wasps. Could you tell us a bit about what inspired them? They're both very different imaginings of the animal and insect world, and they're both very political in their own way.
Yeah. A Storm of Stings, the idea for that came from Game of Thrones, because at least the initial, and I'm talking about the TV show, the initial seasons were amazing. I will not talk about the last 2 or 3 months where they ruined everything, but they were a phenomenon when they were airing. And when I sat down to write a story for this collection, I wanted to include bees into it, because there is a lot of news articles and stuff about how the population of bees is decreasing because of climate change. And so I wanted to bring them into the collection. But I kept thinking, how do I make it interesting and fun? And when I read up more about how their own societies are managed, how there is a queen and then there are worker bees, and there's the concept of royal jelly and all sorts of things, it made sense to me to make it into a royal story with all sorts of backstabbings. It's a very dramatic story. It's not very subtle or anything, but I had a lot of fun just sort of imagining what Game of Thrones, but in a bee world, would look like. And with the other one, a Corvid Inspector, I keep seeing these reels and stories about people sort of befriending crows, and crows basically giving them return gifts of like coins and twigs and all sorts of shiny stuff. And then when I read up more about them, that they're part of the Corvid family, and then there are magpies and treepees and ravens. There are so many birds under the Corvid family, and each of them is interesting in their own way. And each of them is quite intelligent as well. So I thought that would be a really cool idea to use this family in the story. With all my stories, I like to pick up on established terms and idioms and make a story around them. Like with the golden bird, I had Sone Ki Chidiya. Then there is a story called Barking Up the Wrong Tree, which was again just what if I write a story just with barking up the wrong tree as a framing narrative. And with Corvid Inspector, when I was going through nonfiction titles on corvids and crows, I came upon Murder of Ravens and Crows and what that specific bird group is called. So right then, the idea struck me that I have to make it a murder mystery. I also happened to chance upon this news article about how crows and ravens, they hold funerals for other dead crows. Like people have noticed like a dead crow lying at the center and other crows surrounding it. And then another thing I happened to chance upon was the concept of anting, where they rub their wings and feathers on the ground where ants are walking around to clean their feathers, but it also gives them a bit of a high. And I thought that would fit really well into the concept of this alcoholic detective who has a traumatic past and who is very tired but is still brilliant. So all these things fell into place. Another inspiration was Wildings by Nilanjana Roy, which is about feral cats and pet cats in the Delhi region. So when I read that, I absolutely loved the story. So I thought that it would be a cool idea to sort of, like she had done with Wildings and gone into the world of cats, I would go into the world of crows.
I do love that book as well. It's one of my favorites. And I think it was so fascinating because the minute I started reading it, I thought of A Murder of Crows. And I loved that there was a reference to an unkindness of ravens. This is the kind of nerdiness that I adore. You mentioned Barking Up a Wrong Tree, which was actually one of my favorites, also because of the format that you chose, which is a podcast. The narrative, which was retroactive reporting or fact-finding about someone who is very notorious. And he's hailed as a kind of tech messiah by some people and a criminal by others. It kind of made me think about all these billionaires that we see in the news. And, Elon Musk is always making a scene of himself in some way or the other. It was kind of from the perspective of the teacher whose assignment inspired him to create his most famous invention and her views on him afterwards. So what made you write this story? Because it really echoes in a very ridiculous way my fears about the tech oligarchy.
You're absolutely right. Elon Musk was the inspiration for the tech guru in this story, and how ridiculous I think most of his fans are. But yeah, coming back to the format of it, this story was something that I couldn't figure out how to crack it because it didn't make sense to me to write it in a normal narrative form, paragraph upon paragraph, because then it would just be about these two characters talking about this third character. So I thought, since anyway, this is how the story is going to unfold, it would make more sense if it was a question-answer format. I really like the idea of taking up idioms and stuff and sort of creating a story out of that. So when I realized that barking up a wrong tree could be a fun idea, like there's so much that you can do with it, because bark means two things. If you mix those two up, then it can lead to so many weird parts. So yeah, that was how I approached this story, and Elon Musk, you're absolutely correct, was the inspiration for this.
Okay, listeners, you can't see me right now, but I'm like cheering silently that I absolutely nailed this questionable inspirational figure. And I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about Elon Musk, unfortunately. And part of that is thinking about his grand plans to colonize Mars. And so I was really drawn to the stories where you explored what would happen if mankind left Earth and what would happen to the ones who stayed. And I'm talking about A Forest of Plenty and Crown Shyness. And to me, they're extremes of the same spectrum in a way. And what inspired you to write those?
With crown shyness, again, I just love the term crown shyness. I thought it's such an interesting combination of words. So like the top part of the tree, that's what's called the crown shyness, where there might be two trees next to each other, but their leaves will not touch right at the top. That thing is called crown shyness. And I thought it's such an interesting combination of words. And that led me to thinking, what if some time in the future, this is a bit of spoiler, but I think this is okay. What if trees were the ones protecting us? Like, how would that kind of a world look? And I think this is something that comes up in a few other stories as well. The idea of caging birds and sort of freeing caged birds. So I thought, I have looked into it using clouds and using dragons and all sorts of other things. What if humans were the ones feeling caged, and how would that look like? So that was my idea with crown shyness, basically. And for Forests of Plenty, the inspiration for that was basically quite a few sci-fi movies and TV shows, and read like these space operas and these stories where humanity exists on a massive spaceship, or they're looking for a new planet to live on. But the inside of these spaceships always look really cold to me. I mean, obviously they're made of metal, so there will be an aspect of coldness to them. But that was the sort of image in my mind. Emotions are not really that paramount. The main thing is survival and how to protect humanity more than the individual. So with Forests of Plenty, that's what I basically try to imagine. What would a human society look like if they were closed within this spaceship where they couldn't really go out, but they had to manage everything inside. And the main focus was the survival of humanity more than anything else.
I found it really interesting that in both, there is a sense of a return to basics, a kind of respect for the cycle of life. In the first one, Crown Shyness, I enjoyed the idea that if you weren't a good person by a kind of random metric, you wouldn't make it onto the planet itself. Instead of human beings creating that judgment, it would be nature. And I thought that was really fascinating, a sort of very interesting role reversal. And with A Forest of Plenty, I kind of respected the idea that in order to keep things going, keep the population in check, keep the cycle of life in its natural order, which I think the disruption of which has led to all these problems on our planet currently. They honor it in an extreme way. I don't want to give away too much to people who haven't read the book. It feels very back to basics in a real way.
Yeah, with both of them, the main thing is survival and how to maintain a certain way of life, which they think is the way forward, is the only way to maintain a balance. And it's interesting that you picked both these stories because in my mind, they do exist in the same universe. I sort of imagine that the people in the Forest of Plenty, several years down the line, they are the ones coming to the planet in Crown Shyness.
Thank you for confirming that, because that was going to be my next question. I was going to ask if they existed in the same universe. That's so fascinating. Oh, and two other stories really stood out to me. One is Eat Flicks, and the other is Solastalgic. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Eat Flicks, because I think it was an exploration of very human emotions and concerns in a world without humans. And Solastalgic, because it explores something I've never really thought about, which is the guilt that follows you when you leave your home and the concept of wanting to go back even if there's nothing much to return to. And also, I really love that they're dinosaurs. Anyone who hasn't read the book, if you need anything to persuade you, there are dinosaurs. Could you tell me a bit more about the process behind that, behind creating these stories?
So for Eat Flicks, the idea was Korean food. So I get these ideas from weird places and then they turn into stories somehow. With the Eat Flicks, it's basically my desire to eat all sorts of Korean foods that I see on K-dramas. The idea with that was, what if I could actually eat the food that was on the TV? Like a very Charlie and the Chocolate Factory kind of thing. Basically picking out the food from the screen. And that's how Eat Flicks took shape. When I decided that, okay, this is how I'm going to approach my desire to eat more Korean food in the story, it made sense to me that it would be a post-human world because it didn't feel very logical that humans would gain the ability to eat something from a TV screen. It made more sense that an android would be the one who would be able to do that. That was my logic behind the setting of the story. And the third aspect of the story is my setting it in Delhi and referencing Khan Market and Connaught Place. Those two markets, incidentally, are two of my favorite markets in Delhi. The third being GK. I really like the metro station in Khan Market and how near it is to the actual market. So that's how I started the story. I wanted to imagine Khan Market when nature has taken over, but there are plants growing everywhere and there are animals everywhere. So yeah, that was my idea with that. Some of my favorite movies and stories are where humanity is sort of dying out or humanity is already dead, but then there is a robot or an android who had lived with humans, and it's from their point of view and them sort of reminiscing about the past and how they felt about humans. And there's such a beautiful sadness to that aspect. It also feels nostalgic to me for some reason. Again, I can't explain. I wanted to capture that sadness in this story in Eat Flicks. And again, sadness is something that I also explore in Solastalgic. It's a kind of nostalgia mixed with sadness. You want to go back to how the world used to be, but you know that you cannot go back to it. Solastalgia is actually something that I came upon while I was researching for this story. This is a term that social scientists came up with, and I thought that would be the best title for this story. In Celestial J, these humans have finally found a new home, a new planet, but there are these group of people who feel very guilty about the fact that they couldn't save their planet. It felt like such a serious story to me that I knew I had to make the ending extremely weird. And there's a sort of tonal shift in when you come across the dinosaurs because they sort of appear out of nowhere. But again, I've tried to write it in a way that makes sense in their society, as in it doesn't come out of nowhere, but it also feels extremely weird. That was why I brought in dinosaurs into this story. I think subconsciously Jurassic Park was also at the back of my mind. I thought, what if you could do what Jurassic Park had done, but sort of give the dinosaurs a bit of purpose?
I love that. And I must tell you that when I read it, I kind of visualized that opening scene of Jurassic Park, when they're in the Jeep and they see the dinosaurs for the first time. I'm glad to know it is kind of a homage to Jurassic Park. I thoroughly enjoyed both those stories.
Thank you. Thank you.
Another one that really struck me was Losing, which features a singer called Mrinalini, whose voice conjures up rain and making her very invaluable to a very drought-stricken world. And I've heard of various indigenous peoples using movement like rain dance and things like that to summon rain, but I'd not really heard anything about music. So was there some kind of connection to that, to these folk tales and practices, which kind of inspired you?
Yeah, so for this one, my main inspiration was Tansen and how he could basically summon rain with his singing. And it felt like such an interesting concept to explore in a speculative fiction story. It made even more sense to sort of set it in a world where there are droughts, where there is scarcity of water. And since there was an Indian setting in this, I knew that there would have to be a sort of a political angle to it as well. Like we've seen how politicians all over the world, but especially Indian politicians, like they will use celebrities and people for their own campaigns and stuff like that. So it sort of made sense to me that a singer with this kind of an ability would feel pressured by the government. Even if her voice disappears or she injures herself, the government wouldn't really care. They would basically want votes at the end of the day. So that was the political side of it. But yeah, I think with this story, there is a bit of hope with the fact that she has a bunch of students who have the potential to carry forward this gift. I think it's one of my more open-ended stories in the sense that it was my intention to sort of make the reader feel uneasy as to what exactly will happen. Another thing was I had Elon Musk in my mind with Barking Up the Wrong Tree. With this one, Mrinalini, basically I had Shubha Mudgal as the face for this character. And it sort of helped me to imagine her being in this role and dealing with politicians and students and her own sense of identity, because for sure there is a higher purpose with her ability, but music has been her identity since she could sing. So losing was both losing her identity, her voice, as well as what would happen to the world after she lost her voice.
That was the bit that really struck me, the uncertainty of the whole thing, because, there's a little bit of a gap between when she might not be able to sing anymore and when her students will be ready to sing to her caliber. And that uncertainty really weighs on her, and you can see her contemplating what's going to happen. It's very clear that her well-being is secondary to this fantastic ability she has. And also, I thought it was so typical that they're not trying to address the root of these problems. They're not trying to fix drought by like any ecological measures. They're just banking on this woman to sing her heart out and bring them rain. And I was just thinking how perfectly and horribly realistic that is. I think we can kind of start wrapping things up because we've talked for quite a while. I wish we had time to go over each story because I have a million more questions. And I think we'll be here all day if that's the case. But I did want to ask, this is a collection of very varied stories.
We've discussed some themes, but what do you think is kind of a thread that runs through the whole thing? Is there something that to you connects them all together?
You are right. That was something that I had in mind. Even though there is nature, there are plants, trees, animals in each story in some form or the other. I also wanted them to feel different because they're quite short stories and some of them are like just 1.5 page even. So I wanted them to sort of feel like you have a box of sweets and each has a different flavor basically, but you are eating a box of sweets. That was my intention with this short story collection. And coming to a thread that binds them all, of course, there's an overall theme of nature, but one of my main things with writing each story was that if possible, I wanted to have some form of justice for animals and plants. For example, in Cocoon, which is about silkworms, that came about because of an acquaintance of mine who used to work with the Silk Board of India. And she was talking about how, in a very casual way, that some of these silkworms try to escape from their trays or wherever they're kept. And I felt so sad for the silkworms that they are eventually basically boiled alive for silk. And I wanted to create a story where there would be some form of justice or they would be able to escape the fate that humanity has handed to them. And with other stories as well, I've tried to give animals and nature the sort of happy ending that I feel that they don't necessarily get in the real world.
I love that. And I think you've done a wonderful job with that. And before we sign off, I have one last question. Are you working on anything currently, or do you have anything in the pipeline that we should look out for?
Yeah, so I'm working on a novel finally because I feel like I've done a novel, I've done a collection. I must tackle the novel. It's something I feel that I have to do. So yeah, I'm working on a novel right now and it's going to be about consciousness and it's going to be set in the future. So artificial intelligence also has a role to play, but not the kind of AI that we see on social media, ChatGPT or those like stolen artwork and videos, not that kind of stuff. It's AI in a different role. And it's basically, I'm looking at the future of humanity. What would that look like several thousand years into the future? And after that, I have, I think about 7 or 8 ideas about, again, a mix of novellas, novels, and short story collections. I want to come back to my background in geography because I feel like there's so much that inspires me, like the world around me inspires me so much that I want to get back to geography. So that's a short story collection that I'll probably tackle after the novel. And that will basically be about mountains, rocks, lakes, seas, those kind of stuff. So yeah, that's all I'm going to reveal right now. But yeah, these two are the next projects that I'm working on.
Okay, that's a fantastic reveal because as a fan of your writing, I have a lot to look forward to. And also, I do feel that if there was a ChatGPT based novel, it would be a horror story.
It would be. Yes, exactly.
Anyway, thank you so much for being on Arcx, Gigi. And thank you for joining us today. And congratulations again on Biopeculiar. It's a fantastic book. Listeners, please, if you want to know more, which I think you will after this episode, you better go buy the book.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for this interview, for your questions, and for actually coming up with connections that are these Easter eggs in the story. So thank you so much for recognizing them.
Arcx is a mini-series from the Subverse, the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. Follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine or visit darkandlight.com for episode details and notes.